Well, I'd like to start off by thanking all of the speakers this morning for their very, very informative talks. And we do have a few questions that have come in, and I would like to encourage everyone out there to continue to submit your questions, as well as some of the panelists. We can ask a few questions. So one of the first questions I got is, I believe this is for you, Carrie Jo, and that is, can you give an example of how the rare disease division, the new one that you talked about, is working with the review division to help support unique challenges with rare diseases?
Yes, of course. So I had a slide on a number of the things that the rare diseases team is doing. I think that what has changed with the creation of the hub is that we really have our policy and programming directly informed by the review work that is going on 100% of the time within the division that we are located. So really what it has done is just sort of enhanced our ability to interact with other O&D divisions, as well as continue to interact with our colleagues at CBER, which we do on a nearly daily basis because we have a lot of shared indications in rare diseases, and colleagues, at CDRH, to really better match policy and programming with the needs that reviewers are seeing on a day-to-day basis. So I hope that helps.
Yes, thank you. And then Lynn, we also received a question. I think that's probably best answered by you. I mean, you talked about extrapolation, and you talked quite a bit about efficacy extrapolation, but what about safety extrapolation? Can you give an example of the information or data necessary for safety extrapolation? And especially in very young pediatric patients, that's where it gets, what shall we say, a bit scary.
Sure. So firstly, the question demonstrates, so I applaud the questioner, that they've actually looked at the guideline, because, for, I don't know, the first 20 years of, our work in extrapolation, there was, I think, a commandment that thou shalt not extrapolate safety. And that sort of, spread across lots of development programs. And so there was this belief that you really couldn't extrapolate safety, that pediatric extrapolation was really only limited to efficacy. And the reality is that we've been extrapolating safety for a long time. And this new guideline really goes into what we think needs to be considered in an extrapolation approach related to safety. But Dave, to your point and to the questioner's point, it has all to do, again, we've heard it a lot sprinkled throughout all of these speakers, right? How much certainty, how much uncertainty, how much confidence, how much data do you have? And in fact, in the youngest populations, in neonates, oftentimes we have very little information, and we also have low confidence that what would happen in a 16-year-old would be similar to what would happen in a preterm infant who's at 37 weeks. So the idea of pediatric extrapolation as it relates to safety is not really to say that, again, in any cookbook approach, that if you have 100 patients with 6 months of safety, well, then you're golden. It really depends on the population you're studying, how much data you have. But I think what's really important about this guideline is it puts forth the idea that we want you to give us the data. We want you to consider the data in whatever ways you want to synthesize, analyze, and interpret those safety data, and come up with an approach that maybe utilizes some extrapolation of safety or not.
Oh, very good. Any other comments from the other panelists? Yeah, Ashley, I see your hand is up.
Yeah, I was just lowering my microphone. Yeah, I do have one. And when we think specifically about childhood cancer, but that may apply to other rare diseases as well, there is a big push for us to increase and accelerate pediatric drug development. There is a high need there. So everybody celebrated race. Yeah, hooray, we are going to have this now. But now, if I'm looking at the Optimus project and the presentation provided by Julia, now we are proposing a delay. And I'm wondering if this delay is really necessary, because these diseases are mostly very different. So can we really, is the data we are collecting in the adult population that much needed for us to really afford delaying the studies in the pediatric population? Just some food for thoughts for us perhaps to discuss.
Thank you. Thank you, Ashley. And do we have any comments to follow up on Ashley's?
Hi, yeah, this is Lauren Price. I'm a clinical pharmacology reviewer at FDA, and I work with some of the members of our Project Optimus team. I do just want to note that the idea is not to delay the development in pediatric patients. We are certainly encouraging our sponsors to consider pediatrics early in development, particularly when there is a pediatric indication. As we're seeing more and more of these targeted therapies where we can identify a particular mutation group or a particular patient population that may benefit, to not delay that development, to consider enrolling pediatric patients as soon as the scientific data support inclusion of those patients. We do have a guidance specifically on oncology encouraging inclusion of adolescent patients in adult oncology clinical trials. And there are other guidance documents available as well, including our recently published tissue agnostic guidance that touches on pediatric patients and making sure that those patients are included when relevant in drug development programs.
Thank you, Lauren. And I'm not going to let you get away. I'm going to ask you a follow-up question that we received. And Glenn, I see your hand up, and Sam, I see your hand up. So we'll get right back to you. But using modeling and simulation it's part of the norm now in drug development. But in pediatric populations, especially in the very young patients, when they conduct a study, in particular, what if no participants are enrolled at the lower end of the age spectrum due to the rarity of the disease or the rarity of the cancer type? I must admit, I see this as almost extrapolating off the end of your curve, but how do you feel about that?
Yeah, so certainly we see cases where perhaps a disease is more common in certain age ranges, especially in oncology at the very youngest patients. It is unusual for us to have substantial enrollment of those very youngest pediatric patients. And so we always want to take into consideration the rarity of that population, obviously, as well as the feasibility of conducting these studies, and encouraging sponsors to look broadly at approaches with where they could enroll these patients or could identify potential issues for these patients, or other approaches to identify perhaps dosages that may be within that optimal dose range in pediatric patients that may be underrepresented in clinical trials.
Okay, thank you very much. Why don't I go to you, Glenn? You've had your hand up for a while.
Well, thank you very much. So just to say, I think that we probably all applaud what the FDA are asking us to do here, which is to find the right dose. And one of my frustrations is that to a degree we still do believe in oncology that we're developing cytotoxics, and although that sometimes is the case, most of the time we're not. I also completely agree with what Lauren has alluded to, and I tend to guide the people I work with in the direction that she suggested. But there are a number of buts here. Richard and Lauren have made it very clear, Richard Passer and Lauren made it very clear that they don't want to slow down drug development, and I believe that. But what I have seen is that Project Optimus has caused at least a stall in the development of a number of projects. I've seen projects that I was expecting to move into the clinic not be able to get the funding to do that, and projects that we're looking to move out of what we used to call phase 1, and I believe that we don't call it that anymore, and I'm quite pleased about that, into that proof of concept part of the experiment. Now, my hope is that that's just a rabbit in the headlights type of response, and that as we get clearer guidance from the FDA and people have had time to think about it, that we will move that forward. But there are a few issues, particularly with regards to pediatrics. PK/PD is something that we should be doing, and we should be modelling that. And as you said, Dave, that is the norm now. But some mechanisms of action don't have good pharmacodynamic biomarkers. And that's an issue. The other issue with pharmacodynamic biomarkers is that we often don't understand the intra-subject and inter-subject variability of those pharmacodynamic markers, even in adults. And to do that in children is something that we probably do need to do. The other issue is that although many of these circulating biomarkers are circulating, sometimes we actually need to understand what's going on within the tumour. Again, that's difficult to do in a lot of patients, even more so in children. But I do think there is an opportunity, a collaborative opportunity across industry, academia, charities to maybe generate some of these data in a drug agnostic fashion. So at least it's there as real world data, and we are being encouraged to look at real world data and see whether or not we can turn that into real world evidence. I suppose the concern I do have, apart from the fact that we are potentially slowing things down, and although we're not needing to, is just the number of individuals that are required to generate enough pediatric data to then model against the human data. And I don't think that's an insignificant number of individuals. So that's maybe something we want to think about. The other aspect, I suppose, I've got for Lauren as well, is I liked your slide on how we should be doing things, backfilling cohorts, getting PK/PD data, and that's what I'm encouraging people to do. But at the end of that, you want us to randomize against 2 doses of the drug. Now, part of me says, well, that's what we used to do. You go back and look at the aromatase inhibitors. That's what we did. We took 2 doses into the phase 3 study. But that does require a larger number of patients. And if there is almost a spinal response from the regulators, which is no matter what clever PK/PD modeling you do, we still want to see you compare 2 doses of this drug. Companies will just compare the 2 doses of the drug, and they won't do the PK/PD dosing. So I think there does need to be reassurance from the FDA that if you do it properly and you have the right pharmacodynamic markers, beyond that point, you only have to take 1 dose forwards, rather than what I'm concerned might be a spinal response. That's a lot of comments there, so my apologies. But on the whole, I think we probably all applaud the philosophy. We just need to work out how now best to deliver the philosophy, and that's not going to happen overnight. I'll stop talking.
Well, thank you, Glenn. Thank you very much. Well, I guess I'll give, you called out a few people. I'll give them a chance for a rebuttal at this point, if any of them would like to. And then Angela, I'm coming to you next, unless you're ready with something.
Well, I think Glenn actually touched on several of the things I was going to say, but I think my main point is, there's the real world data of how we actually do this, the drug development, and that's not something that is modeled or captured, like the challenges that we have as sponsors when we're putting together these drug development plans, when we're looking at what data to collect, where to integrate that, where to inform our pediatric plans. There are a lot of our own challenges, right, across companies. And I'm not sure that while we have a guidance, which I think is the ideal, we are in the real world piece, and there's this gap, a large gap. And, I can remember when extrapolation was new and, there was, trying to get the buy-in and where we've come so far. But now the dose optimization in the oncology setting, and then you add the pediatric piece on top of that. The word uncertainty came up quite a bit in different the presentations, and I think that's issue, right? Like there's this large amount of uncertainty, and with the rare disease or rare cancer, you already have intrinsic uncertainty. And then we talk about how to optimize a dose, not only in a rare disease, a rare cancer, but in a pediatric setting. So I think, as you know, as I've talked with my colleagues over the past several months, since that white paper came out, you know, we're just kind of in a conundrum at this point. You know, everyone's trying to kind of figure out how we can still keep the speed or even accelerate, but, you know, apply these expectations in our development plans.
Thank you very much, Angela. That was good. Len, I'll come back to you, but how about if Krithika, did you have a comment? I'm trying to get to everybody at least once here, but Len, I'll be right back to you.
Right, so I was reacting to something Glen mentioned earlier when he was commenting, and actually this is more of a question than an answer. For one of the FDA speakers, Lauren might be a good fit to address this. I was thinking about what Glen mentioned in the context specifically of development programs where an adult indication, the pediatric indication is different from the adult, or there isn't an adult program. And I realized I'm making an assumption, just as Glen is, that the full Project Optimus spectrum of expectations is now relevant and applicable in that particular setting, which may not necessarily be true, because the search space I started looking at when I considered that question was what's historically been done for non-onc drugs, and are those more a relevant model or example of development programs in such situations than the expectations for adult development programs under Project Optimus. So I just wanted to maybe check in with Lauren, some of the other FDA speakers, to see if they have any thoughts on that particular point, on sample sizes, on the utility of things like expanded access program data to help with dose justification in pediatric settings for the specific context of when extrapolation from adults is not possible for efficacy.
Great. Do we have a volunteer here from one of the health authorities?
I'll give some brief comments, but certainly happy to have other colleagues weigh in as well. I think that first, just to address sort of the elephant in the room, we're very aware that this is a paradigm shift, and that will take time to really permeate through the whole system, and to really optimize the approaches that we're taking in order to identify, the best dosages moving forward. There will be many iterations for different specific development programs that may need to take different portions of an approach. Thinking about this concept of potentially a pediatric specific disease or indication, this is where going to Lynn's presentation and this idea of the continuum, how much information can we borrow from other populations, whether that be adults in a different disease, whether that be other pediatric populations, really gets us into thinking about how much of that data can we leverage, how much additional data do we need, and what's going to be the best way to address, again, that uncertainty that we have. So certainly happy to have other colleagues weigh in as well.
All right. Well, why don't we check in with Lynn here?
Yeah, there are a lot of things that I want to address, but let me first go to this notion of, where are drug developers? FDA's put out guidance, but we're still not sure what we're supposed to do here, right? I hear that. We hear that loud and clear. I think there's two things I would say. The first is that we're always available on specific drug development programs to meet with you, to help you move through that, because every drug development we know is unique, is different in some way. The more important point I want to make that I think relates to pediatrics, oncology, rare diseases, is that we are all in this space, not because we like certainty, we just want to do the next Me Too, B2, right? Because if you were interested in that kind of drug development, you're not you're not listening in on this conference, period. I already know that, right? And the other point I want to make is that by the nature of what we're doing here, what all of we're doing in this conference, those of us who are working in this space, there's this tension between regulatory certainty, which we all want to have, and innovation and adaptation, right? That whole notion of feeding information back into the system is not regulatory certainty, because we're taking what we've learned and making something new. So I want to emphasize that point because we're all in this space. And if we can all work together, then we can help, create the paths together, however uncertain or however much data we need. You might argue with me about, well, I want this much data, you want that much data. But I think the bottom line is that we're all recognizing that what we have to do is justify as well as we can and describe and explain what do we know, what do we not know, and what data do we need to bridge what we know to what we don't know.
Well said, Lynn. Well said.
Yeah, thank you very much, Glen. James? I think there we go.
Yeah, hi there. Yeah, I was interested in the comment in one of the talks about the use of preclinical models, specifically PDX models, and I wondered about the extent of the intention there. Is that to simply demonstrate that the mechanism of the drug is relevant in pediatric cancers, or could it be taken further and building some prior information about the relative exposure response relationship in adult cancers versus pediatrics?
So I think that might have been in one of Julie's slides. I do believe her intent there, just from prior conversations with her, was both of those aspects, James. So where possible, just not just demonstrating proof of mechanism, proof of concept in a pediatric setting, but also comparative assessment of whether or not exposure response relationships with efficacy or safety might be expected. Well, efficacy, sorry, not safety, might be expected to be similar in adult versus pediatric patient populations.
Good. Thank you, Krithika. I have another question here from, well, I have a couple more from the crowd. And one is, we heard a little bit about RDEA, the rare disease endpoint assessment, or I can't remember what the A stands for, and the fact that it's focusing on endpoints and that we have this new initiative coming up. And I guess the question I received here was that it sounds like we'll have one new assessment in 2023, and then maybe 3 after that in the following years. And the questions that came in are those adequate? I mean, are we moving quick enough, given the fact that there's 7,000 rare diseases, or is it just logistics? And then the other aspect to the question I received was, is there a similar initiative in the EMA or with other health authorities that people know about?
Yeah, so I'll start from the FDA perspective, and then I'll let my colleagues from the EMA jump in. But it's a good question whether that's sort of moving quick enough. But I think, to Lynn's earlier point, a lot of this is dynamic, right? And it is challenging to develop endpoints in the rare disease space and get everyone at the table who needs to be at the table early enough to have a well-defined novel endpoint in an area where drug development, is new, burgeoning, or has not occurred. And with this understanding, there's always a logistical aspect of it, right? But with that understanding, that's why it was so important in this program to have the public disclosure aspect, so that what we're learning can be translated broadly to all those who may be able to utilize information that can help them develop robust endpoints. And I did say during the talk, as we receive submissions, we're really looking to give preference to those proposals that have the impact that have impact on rare disease drug development more broadly, right? So an endpoint that might be able to be utilized across multiple indications, or that have and really demonstrate a methodology that could be applicable across the design of different endpoints. So we're hoping that was a really important aspect of this program, and we're hoping to share that more broadly.
Yeah, I think based on our earlier talks today, Art Kaplan is probably applauding your data sharing thoughts there.
Yep.
And then what about the EMA? Does anyone know, or other health authorities around the world, are there other groups that are looking to do something like that, looking at the endpoints that we know of? Apparently not right now.
I guess one other thing I can offer on international collaboration is collaboration in general is a core foundation of successful rare disease drug development. And my team, we currently have an international rare disease cluster where we discuss not just individual applications or scientific challenges with those applications, but also broader challenges in rare disease, and that is in conjunction with the EMA and with Health Canada. So I can't speak as to what programs are doing on their ends, but certainly learnings that we have, we do share with our international partners, because drug development in this space is global. And it's necessary for us to discuss those challenges.
Thank you very much. And then Ashley, do you have a comment here or a question?
I have, but it's not necessarily on what Carrie was alluding to, but I would like to go back to the accelerating part. When I made my comment, I was referring to childhood cancer, so not when you have an adult cancer that also occurs in children, and of course you have to include them. I was referring specific to the childhood cancers, and we have expanded on that and the issues that we will be facing in defining the dose response, but that's something we need to figure out, and collaboration will certainly help with that. The specific point I would like to go back to is actually related to the timing. And I know it may sound crazy for someone with my affiliation to raise this question, but why will we need to wait? I mean, if I see Julie's presentation, okay, end of phase 2 will be delayed, so the whole pediatric plan will be delayed. But the exposure response relationship in this population is very likely to be different. So will this data really be informative? Do we really need to wait? Can't we start things earlier? Can we get on an earlier phase already some signs of clinical activity? And then use this data for further development. Just some food for thought, open for discussion.
Well, and if I could I just happened to receive a question that was very related to that. And then Krithika, I saw you come off mute, so we'll jump over to you to answer that. But the question actually was that, and I think this has to do with getting to work earlier, and that's since pediatric tumor cell lines are available, would a type of comparison in the in vitro testing between the pediatric and adult cell lines provide some of that preliminary evidence in getting started early? Would that be possible? And so, Krithika, I may have taken you off in a direction that you didn't want to go, but I'm going to you now.
In true clone farm form, I was about to answer a question with another question, just to clarify what Ashley was thinking about. So Ashley, just make sure I understand your point correctly. You were speaking specifically about initiating independent development programs for childhood-only cancer populations, correct?
No, it's about target therapy. We have many different indications, and we happen to have an indication that it's also a childhood cancer.
So
ladies as well.
Right. So I think what Julie's presentation was pointing to was largely in situations where there is good reason to think you can leverage adult data to narrow down research space for the dose optimization in kids. So in the situation where you're planning to extrapolate the adult efficacy data into pediatrics, it makes more sense to wait until you have a better handle of the adult efficacious dose. And I think that's primarily what that slide was intended to point out. So in that situation, it makes more sense to wait until the adult expansion is complete. You have a better handle. I know you have a question before you initiate the pediatric discussions, right? At the IPSP. In the situation where it's expected that the pediatric population is likely to be sufficiently different from the adult indication you're initially developing in, I agree with what Lauren was pointing out earlier, and what I understand trying to say. It doesn't necessarily have to be gated on completing the adult expansion phase and having that information before you can start that development program in parallel. I see both Glen and you have questions, so I'll stop here and see if I can help address.
Okay. Why don't we go over to Glen? Did you have a question?
No, it's just more of a comment. I think that some of the comments that are already made really do play to this. I mean, traditionally, there are two things that have triggered pediatric studies. Either the view that we now have a drug, so therefore we can take that into children, right, or we've got to the point where the regulators are forcing us to do it. I say those things slightly facetiously, but maybe not that facetiously. My own view is that we should be starting with pediatric studies at a much earlier time point, and that's going to make some people uncomfortable, I think. Those people who hold to the idea that we should only be taking drugs into children. And you know, I'm actively encouraging people to bring younger teenagers into studies, and with a lot of these diseases, that it makes sense. But then the question is, when do you start those studies in those younger patients? And it probably needs to be earlier than we're doing it at the moment. And therefore, how do you encourage the investors? Because those are the ones who are normally putting the brakes on these things, the investors, to do that. And you know, that's a difficult one to ask, because they're the people I tend to come up against when we start talking about pediatrics, because the response is we'll do it when we're forced to do it, which is a solid state of affairs.
Thank you very much, Glen. Angela, why don't we go to you, and then Sam will come to you next.
Just to kind of piggyback on what Glen said, and you know, I wonder when patient advocacy groups are brought in early, or where a company has this, you know, really formed a relationship, does drug development in the pediatric space look different? You know, do you come in earlier? Are we looking to be more innovative in the design of our trials? That was the kind of a first question to the group, you know, in your experience. And then to Ashley's point about when you have biological activity, when you have a signal, you know, I've always been in those discussions, like, when is enough enough, you know, and the lens that some different team members, even right within a company, look through, they have different interpretations of what is enough. To Glen's point, you know, when do you, you know, invest in the pediatric program? So those are, you know, not really comments, but questions, I think, to the group, because I do think this may look different in terms of timing when a company has a relationship with a patient advocacy group.
Yeah, I can, maybe I'll follow on with that, because I can actually attest, you know, to the impact of both the role of patient advocacy in initiating early pediatric oncology development, and then also making the case to investors to do that work. So, you know, we picked up a drug that was an old a drug from a large pharma company that was being developed for melanoma and was being wound down. But through academic work supported by a relatively large pediatric oncology patient advocacy organization, they started a phase 1 dose escalation trial really before the adult program got to proof of concept. And so when the program was terminated, there was phase 1 data with both, you know, PK safety and some efficacy signals in adults, and we were able to come in and look at that. So I think, you know, to maybe the point that Angela raised, you know, there are opportunities through investigator-sponsored trials for pediatric work to begin on the sort of the dime, if you will, of advocacy organizations who are really committed to investing in moving drugs into clinical trials. Not everything has to be done. Not all clinical trials have to be done by sponsors. And I think it's enlightened pharmaceutical companies that are willing to make drugs available sooner for investigator-sponsored research in pediatric oncology populations. Everybody, seems to forget that that's a perfectly valid way of generating data. Now, whether or not that data can be used to support regulatory applications depends on the quality of that data. And I have found that the FDA is willing to partner here because they recognize that you can't have your cake and eat it too. And sometimes you have to accept data that may be academic data. This is the case with the CAR T-cell programs, all of which generated their phase 1 data in academic programs and then moved into sponsored research. In terms of the point, though, around investors, I will tell you this. I think that there is almost always a case to make to investors to do drug development in pediatric patients. You just have to do the hard work, and I think to some extent the willingness to say, as long as it's not NPV net present value negative, as long as you're not exposing the company to ridiculous risk, which oftentimes in oncology you're not when you do pediatric development. The toxicity profile of drugs in children oftentimes looks very similar to that in adults, with the exception of some developmental, potentially some toxicities associated with reproductive risk where you have to just be a little bit more careful. The risks are oftentimes equivalent to those in adults, but making the case that something that's NPV neutral, right, but provides considerable social benefit is something worth enabling. And at the end of the day, I think it's just a social commitment that we all have to make and put pressure on drug companies to do. The big pediatric indications are small. The majority of pediatric oncology indications are very small, but it is possible to develop drugs for those patients in a cost-efficient manner. It may not be wildly profitable, but it's not going to be a money loser. And I think that we're all obligated to hold hands and do this together. Otherwise, we're going to have to say that we're willing to let profit stand in the way of new drugs for children with cancer. I don't think any of us wants to do that.
Thank you, Sam. So we are right up to the very end of our time here. However, Len, if you would like to make one final comment, we'll give the FDA the last word here today.
Thank you. I feel honored. Thank you, Dave. One final comment, and it is very similar to what I think Sam is saying, and that is that if you guys aren't going to do it, nobody will. So those of you who are invested in children in your companies, we are relying on you to be champions within your companies to bring these treatments forward. We understand that investors don't want to do a formulation because that's a lot of money if you're not going to if that drug doesn't work in adults, because why am I going to study it at all and develop a formulation if it doesn't work in adults? So they want to have the certainty. And we've already said throughout this session that it's an uncertain venture that we're going into. But if we wait and we maintain the status quo, we're talking about 6 to 9 years of off-label use in children before we get these drugs approved. And we have to do better than that. So I really applaud those of you who are on the panel in the audience today who are in industry, because we rely on you to be the champions within your own companies for the sake of children.